Hi, it's Penny here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the Valdemar series by Mercedes Lackey. So this is a book series that I started reading when I was 11, and it was my most favorite series for a long time. It had a massive impact on me as a person, and I've been really excited to see a lot of people picking this series up lately. But this is a really massive series. I think on Goodreads it says there are 58 books, and it's made up of multiple different trilogies. So I think it can be hard to know where to start. And like, if you start it, are you committing to reading all 50 books? Because that seems like a lot. But you probably don't have to read all 58 books to have a good grounding in the Valdemar world. And you do have some options about where you might start or which books you might read. So I'm going to go through the different books in the different series. Mostly I'm going to go through this in publication order because generally I think publication order is always your safest way to read any bigger series. But as I go through, I'll give you some options about where you might start and which books you might be able to skip if you're not so interested in them, and which books you definitely have to read before you read other ones. So we're going to start with the first series that I found in my library when I was 11, and from then on I was sucked into reading fantasy forever, and that is the Heralds of Valdemar series. So the first book was published in 1987, which is quite a long time ago, and in this one we're following this young girl named Talia who kind of lives in this religious cult on the border of Valdemar where they practice polygamy, and she is expected to get married, pop out 1 billion kids, and do the housework. She's not really looking forward to that life. She's always reading books about the last Herald mage, Vaniel, who we'll talk about more later, and just dreaming of a very different lifestyle. Then this white magical horse comes and takes her away to the capital where she becomes a herald herself. The Heralds of Valdemar are basically this group that works for the monarchy. They do all sorts of things, keeping the peace, political support, and like justice keeping, just whatever's needed to be done in the kingdom. They do it. They try to make the world a better place. They're the heroes of the story, and they're always selected by these magical white horses called companions. They also often have different magical abilities. In this first book, we learn so much about the world, which is why I think it's a really great place to start. It's a really great introduction to the world of Valdemar. It's also just a really, I was going to say sweet coming of age story, and in some ways it is. However, it's worth noting this book series does get into a lot of really darker topics. We have murder and torture and suicide and rape and homophobia and abuse. Like, even though the Heralds of Valdemar are the heroes of the story, there are always some that aren't living up to their ideal, and Valdemar itself is supposed to be a place where they are accepting of all kinds of different people, but again, there are always exceptions within the world, and that's what drives a lot of these stories. Now, before I get into talking about the Last Herald Mage series, which is another really common place where people will start, I do want to talk about the Vows and Honor. I always thought of it as a duology. It's technically a trilogy. In this, we follow Tama and Kethri, who are best friends, blood sisters. Tama is a swordsmaster, and Kethri? I don't know. Kethri is an amazing sorcerer, but she also has this magical sword called Need, and Need allows her, while she's doing magic, she can also be an amazing swordswoman without even thinking about what her body is doing, because basically the sword can take over her. But also, as a cost to that amazing ability, Need will often pull Tama and Kethri towards women that have a desperate need for help. And so we follow these two around as they save these different women, and they're also trying to rebuild Tama's clan. So this duology is a little bit different in that it's not set in Valdemar. So I think it's a good place to start if you just want to try out Mercedes Lackey's writing and get a feeling for the themes that she's dealing with, without perhaps feeling like you're now stuck reading all the Heralds of Valdemar book, or without getting attached to the bigger story of what's going on with the Heralds. But this is also a duology trilogy that you could potentially skip if you're really not interested in it. Potentially, I think it would be a mistake, which I'll touch on again later. But now let's move over to the Last Herald Mage trilogy. I should say I have a picture that I'm looking down at here that I've made for myself to guide myself through this. I'll possibly link that below, but it's very complicated, so who knows if it will help you without my explanation. But the last Herald Mage trilogy, this follows Vaniel. It's another kind of coming of age story. Vaniel lives again in a more isolated area, and his father is very abusive, mainly because his father is incredibly homophobic and afraid that his son is gay, which he is. Vaniel ends up going to stay with his auntie at the Herald Collegium, where he finds still a lot of bigotry, but also some support. This story is incredibly tragic, and I think if you're not ready for some quite heavy homophobia and just awful times, then this isn't the trilogy to pick up. It's also worth noting this trilogy was published around 1990, and I wouldn't make the excuse that it's a product of its time, because I don't think it's necessarily terribly representing things, but thinking and arguments around homophobia and like queer lifestyles has changed a lot. So even I think sometimes when it's trying to be supportive, it might not entirely mesh with like more modern thinking. So that's just something I guess to be aware of. It is still overall very supportive. Like Mercedes Lackey through the whole series, her focus is always on being accepting and being open-minded. So I'm not saying it's a bad representation. I'm just saying let's be aware that time has changed. But anyway, you can definitely start with The Last Herald Mage if that sounds like a more interesting trilogy to you. I would say you want to have read The Last Herald Mage and the Heralds of Valdemar trilogies before you go into the Mage Winds trilogy, which is the next main trilogy. However, there is another book that you might want to consider reading before you go into the Mage Winds trilogy, and that is By the Sword. So this is a standalone story where we follow Kelvren. Kelvren in the Mage Winds trilogy is like the arms master who's teaching some of our main characters how to fight and how to protect themselves. And again, this was published before the Mage Winds trilogy, so that's the order I'd recommend. I do think you could possibly also read it as more of a prequel that you read later to get Kelvren's backstory. I think that is actually the way that when I was younger I read it, and I thought that was fine. It's basically the story of Kelvren becoming a Herald Mage herself. I guess another coming of age story. A lot of these stories are young people finding their place in the world, where that place in the world as part of the Heralds of Valdemar. The other thing to note about Kelvren though is that she is the granddaughter, I think. Anyway, she is a descendant of Kelvren from the Tamar and Kelvren Vows and Honor duology that I talked about previously. Duology, trilogy, let's just call it a duology now. I'll get into the trilogy aspect later. Anyway, you'll either want to read By the Sword before the Mage Winds trilogy or perhaps afterwards as a prequel. I will talk about some other prequels a little bit later, so we could mention it again then. Okay, so also I'm inserting this because I forgot to say it before, because that's how complicated things are. I would say if you're going to read the Tamar and Kelvren Vows and Honor duology, you want to have done it before you go into the Mage Winds trilogy, because Kelvren's magical sword need does show up, and I think you'll get a lot more enjoyment if you already know about the sword when it turns up. It's not mandatory. You'll probably be fine if you haven't read it, because it does explain what the sword is, how it works, but you know, just for fun, I do think it's better if you read them in that order if you're going to read that duology. Although I guess you could also read it like in prequel mode later if you discover that you really need the sword. So now let's talk about the Mage Winds trilogy. In my picture, I've put this together with the Mage Storms trilogy because I think you would be absolutely wrong if you do not read the Mage Winds trilogy and then the Mage Storms trilogy, because it's basically one big story just split into two trilogies, with the Mage Winds trilogy focusing on the Princess Elspeth. In the Heralds of Valdemar series, Talia is working with Princess Elspeth, who is a spoiled little shit in the way she's been raised. And then the Mage Winds trilogy, we're getting Elspeth as she is now kind of coming into being an adult, and she's also gaining her magical abilities. She ends up going off to these forests to the west of Valdemar, where there are these, I forget their name actually, I should have looked it up before I talked to you. Anyway, they're these forest people. I think they're somewhat modeled on the Native American people. They're very close with nature, and they also have these familiars that are these giant birds, as well as being like very experienced magicians. And of course there's a romance. I should say almost every one of these books there's a romance, but I wouldn't say they're fantasy romance exactly. So in the Mage Winds trilogy, we're following Elspeth as she gains her power, and there's also kind of this magical threat introduced. like a bigger threat to the world. So then the Mage Storms trilogy, we're really focusing on that bigger magical threat. But the Mage Storms trilogy is one where instead of focusing mostly on a single character, we get a multi-perspective story where we're following a bunch of different characters as they all play their part in dealing with this bigger magical threat. This is also where we get introduced to the neighboring kingdom, or the kingdom to the south, called Cass, that Valdemar has had a lot of conflict with over the years. And in Cass, it's worth noting that we eventually learn that some of their priests, or some people from that kingdom, have these magical cat companions, very similar to the horse companions in Valdemar. So if you want some magical cats, this is the trilogy to get to, but you do need to at least have read Heralds of Valdemar, Last Herald Mage, and Mage Winds before you read Mage Storms. I will say, I think those 4 trilogies that I've just mentioned are kind of the core story for Valdemar. So if you just wanted to like read the core story and nothing else, those are the 4 you really need to focus on. But there is another trilogy that is connected to the Mage Storms trilogy, and that is the Mage Wars trilogy. So this is one where we go back in time. So I talked about how in Mage Storms we have this big magical threat to the world occurring, and the cause of that event actually happened well in the past, before Valdemar was even a country. There were these 2 very powerful mages, one who's a good guy, one who's a bad guy, and we're following the Griffins and also some other followers of this good wizard guy. The Griffins having been created by this good wizard guy, but he is always experimenting with magic, and somewhere along the way something goes really wrong, and it's basically the fallout of that in this community of both humans and griffins trying to find safety in the world at the time. So the Mage Wars trilogy, first thing to note is this was written as a collaboration between Mercedes Lackey and her husband Larry Dixon. Because of that, it is a little bit more, some of it at least, is a little bit more military focused, and I think that's come primarily from Larry. But he does also do some illustrations for the books that are very nice, so that's a great thing that he has brought to this series. Also, the Mage Wars were released like alternating with the Mage Storms trilogy. So in 1994 you got the first books of both trilogies, then 1995 you got the second books, 1996 you got the third books. And I think that if you're reading this series and you want to read this historical bit, which I think you should, because reading the Mage Storms trilogy and at the same time learning about the original events, like as the people in the Mage Storms trilogy learn about what's going on, you're also learning more historical context around it. I think that's a really nice way to get the story, so I can understand why the authors have planned it that way, and I think to get the optimum result, that's what you should do. But I also think that me, as a younger person, I read the Storms trilogy and then the Mage Wars trilogy, and I think that's also fine. What you do need to do is read both of those trilogies before you go into the next trilogy. So the next trilogy is the Owl Mage trilogy. So in this one, it's kind of interesting because in Mage Storm, things get so epic and we're dealing with a lot of like really important heroic characters. Then in Owlflight, we go out away from the capital of Valdemar and we follow this young boy in a small village as this big magical threat comes to a head, and we see kind of the effect on the everyday person of these events. But then as well, Darian, the main character, did I say that's his name? Anyway, Darian ends up again in this forest that I talked about in the west where Elspeth went earlier to learn all about her magic. He ends up going there, and as you can tell from the covers, getting like a great owl companion. And we do also get the Griffins from the Mage Wars playing a part in this trilogy. Okay, so far, most of the books I've been talking about, most of the trilogies I've been talking about have been mostly following a single timeline with a couple of like offshoots into the history of the world with Vaniel and the Griffins. But after the Owlmage trilogy, things go a bit all over the place and get even more complicated. So firstly, I'm going to mention the short story anthologies that started coming out from 1997. The first one was called Swords of Ice, and it was published around the start of the Owlmage trilogy. So if you're wanting to pick up these anthologies and be sure that it's not spoiling anything, I think this is probably the best time to pick up that first one. I'll talk about all the rest of the anthologies later when I think it makes sense. As well, previously, I was talking about the Vows and Honor duology/trilogy. This is where it becomes a trilogy. So at this point, they wrote a third book. I think it is, again, kind of a short story anthology. I think all of the books with Tama and Key3 are kind of very episodic. So in this, you get, I think, the original story of how they met, as well as some more stories, including some stories when they are a lot older. And it's been a while since I read this one, but I think you also get a glimpse of Kelvren. So again, this is one where you probably could skip it, but if you have found yourself enjoying the stories of Tama and Key3, then you will want to pick this up. Okay, so then we have Brightly Burning. This was released in 2000. We're up to 2000 now. So at this point, the series had been going for over a decade, and we finally got a standalone book. So this is a great place to start if you just want to read one book to try things. Personally, I wouldn't read it until after Mage Storms because it does deal with the conflict with caste, and I think the author's intent was for you to already know a lot of that before you read this as more of a prequel giving you the background. But I think it would still be completely understandable if you read it as a standalone. So we're following this young boy named Levin, and he is a new Herald of Valdemar in the time kind of between the last Herald Mage and the Heralds of Valdemar series, so between Vaniel and Talia. And he has the ability to create fire, and he gets very involved with this conflict with caste. And honestly, this story is incredibly tragic. Again, remember that these books have awful things happening in them all the time, and this is a story about war and a character who can create massive fires. So you can see that things could be pretty awful. But I also think that that awfulness is representative of the greater series, and there is still also so many good messages and so many heartwarming moments to balance up against the darker things. Anyway, if you just want to try one book by Mercedes Lackey and know that you're not going to be dropping off halfway through the series if you don't like it, then this is a good place to start. Then as well, we got some prequels that really link off from the Heralds of Valdemar series, so that very first trilogy. So it is possible that you could read these spin-offs after that first trilogy. I personally would wait a little while so that you really have that nostalgia for those characters and you've seen everything that they are going to do in the Mage Winds and Mage Storms trilogies. But you know, it's up to you. I think it could work. I think it could work as long as you've read the Heralds of Valdemar trilogy. Definitely do not read any of these standalones if you haven't read the Heralds of Valdemar series. Well, maybe you could, but I think I wouldn't recommend it. Anyway, firstly we have another kind of standalone. So I guess you could read this as a standalone if you really want to. We're following this young new Herald again, who used to be living in poverty and was a thief. So we kind of get to see him living in poverty and working as a thief, and then him being chosen as a Herald and how the Heralds use his abilities that he's learnt from being a thief. Then we have a duology known as Alberich's Tale, and this we follow Alberich, who was the weapons master in the Heralds of Valdemar trilogy. So he's the one who taught Talia how to fight and to protect herself, and we learn about his history. So he actually came again from this neighboring kingdom of Cass that Valdemar always has a lot of conflicts with. So I would say, in my opinion, you should read this after Brightly Burning and after the Mage Storms trilogy, only because I believe it's the author's intention that the things you learn about Cass in Alberich's Tale, you should be learning about Cass in a certain order. And I just think if you don't follow the author's intention on that, in some cases you might kind of spoil yourself, or you might be missing some information. Oh, and I will also mention Skiff's Tale, so Take a Thief, as well as Alberich's Tale, were wrapped up into a bind-up of 3 books known as Exiles of Valdemar. It's interesting because Take a Thief was published first, but chronologically, Alberich's Tale actually comes first. So in the bind-up, they put Alberich's Tale first and then Take a Thief. So I think you could read those in whatever order. It doesn't matter. Also, the second book in Alberic's Tale was published in 2003, which is when the second short story anthology came out. So this is about where you should be reading that second short story anthology. I will mention about the short story anthologies. So usually there will be one story from Mercedes Lackey and then a bunch of stories by other authors. So this is a great way to get a bit more Valdemar, but also get to know some other authors that were popular at the time. But it also means like you just don't know what you're going to be getting from these anthologies. I have definitely not read all of the anthologies, but I did read some of the earlier ones and I quite like them, even though short story anthologies aren't always my favorite. I think just the world of Valdemar does lend itself to some really interesting themes, especially around that idea of acceptance and open-mindedness. Okay, now we're going to step over to the side. So in my picture, I've put this way over on the side because it is another place that you could start. So in 2008, Mercedes Lackey started the Collegium Chronicles, and this is kind of, again, set in that time between Vaniel's story and Talia's story, and mostly, or at least as far as I've read, because I haven't read all of these books, but as far as I've read, these are pretty separate stories. So you can read these ones and not spoil yourself for the other kind of timeline. So once again, it's a coming of age story. We're following this young boy named Mags, who is becoming a herald and learning all about Valdemar. So I think that's part of why this is another great place to start, because you do get that reintroduction to the world of Valdemar, like right from the beginning. And like some of our other characters, Mags has some special abilities, and because of that, he ends up being trained as a spy. And there are actually 3 series involving Mags and eventually his love interest and his family. The first one being the Collegium Chronicles, and then we have the Herald Spy, and then we have Family Spies. Because this is all Mags' story as he grows up and goes through different levels of his life, or different parts of his life, what am I trying to say? Anyway, because this is all following Mags, you need to read these 3 series in order. Don't be getting lost. Now, I will admit, I have only read the Collegium Chronicles and then I didn't continue. Mainly, I think that's just because I read the original Valdemar books when I was young, and those are the ones I'm attached to. But I have seen a lot of people reading this newer group of series and really enjoying them. And because these are published like from 2008 through to 2020, I think you'll get less of that issue I was talking about before, where the way that certain themes are dealt with have aged and haven't always aged well. So these ones I think you could go into feeling a lot safer around that. Also, it was alongside these series that they were publishing a lot of the short story anthologies, the same format as I was talking about before, where you tend to get a story from Mercedes Lackey and then a bunch of stories by other authors. And again, these were published kind of alternating with the books from Mags' story. So I would read the next 5 short story anthologies from Crossroads to Under the Veil, kind of alternating with the Collegium Chronicles if you're interested in the short story anthologies. They're definitely ones you could skip if you're not interested. And I mean, I guess you could skip Mags' story altogether if you wanted and probably still be confident that you can say you've read Valdemar books. Anyway, the next 3 short story anthologies also came out alternating with the Herald Spy trilogy, and then Pathways, Choices and Seasons were published alternating with Family Spies. So if you're going to pick up the short story anthologies, that's probably a good place to do it. The only thing I would worry about myself is if you're starting with Mags' story and you haven't read any of the others, there is probably a slight risk of spoilers in some of these short stories. So, if you're reading Mags' story after having read all the others, I think this is a good place to read them. But otherwise, maybe you need to wait until you've read all the other ones, if you're going to, before you come back to the short story anthologies. Also, I should say, since I'm saying you could skip Mags' story if you want, you could also just read Mags' story and it is complete within itself, so then you wouldn't have to read all the other books. But I think you would be missing out. Okay, then I've been talking for a long time, but let's get into the Valdemar books that were published from 2020 on. So firstly, we have the Founding of Valdemar. So Valdemar is called Valdemar because there was this guy called Valdemar who founded the country. And there are references to some things that Valdemar did and where he came from in the Mage Storms trilogy. So again, I personally would read the Founding of Valdemar after having read the Mage Storms trilogy and not before, because I think you probably will spoil the Mage Storms trilogy for yourself a little bit by reading The Founding of Valdemar. I say I think because I haven't read The Founding of Valdemar, but this will be the trilogy where you learn about who he was and you get to learn about how this situation with these companions choosing the Heralds was originally created. Like, what happened there? I haven't read this trilogy, but I would be really interested to learn about it, and I do think I will come back to it at some point. And also, alternating with those Founding of Valdemar books, there were another 4 short story anthologies that you could pick up around this time. And then finally, there is one more trilogy that is currently in the process of being released. So far we've gotten the first book, Griffin in Light. So there is a Griffin that we meet in the Owl Mage trilogy that now we're getting more of their story. It's worth noting that you shouldn't read this before the Owl Mage trilogy. There are also characters, again, I haven't read this trilogy, so somewhat guesses, but there are characters mentioned in the synopsis that are from the Mage Storms trilogy and like previous ones in that line that I've kind of talked about. So I don't think this would be a good place to start for that reason. But we will be getting the second book in that trilogy in June 2024, and I guess 2025, maybe that will finish off, and then it will be really interesting to see where Mercedes Lackey is going to take this world next. Will she continue? Who knows? There is so much potential in the world of Valdemar for writing different stories. I do think because of the fact that the Mage Storms trilogy has this epic magical event that has like such world-changing implications, for me that's always going to be the center of the series, and I can't really see how anything else could ever outdo that epicness. So I really feel like the Heralds of Valdemar, The Last Herald Mage, Mage Winds, and Mage Storms are the center of this world, but it's also so great that there's so many other stories in the world and that you never have to quit Valdemar if you don't want to. Anyway, let me know if you've been reading the Valdemar books and if you've been loving them. Let me know if you think this video was useful to let you know which order to read the books. And of course, let me know if there's any questions you have about the world of Valdemar. I will try to answer down in the comments. And do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.